So I did get the Damascus bar we made in the last video cut up, and I've got it to where I've got a couple blades to make from 2 of these pieces, and the others are going to be bolsters and back spacers. I still have to surface grind, get them to the thicknesses I want, and then I'll cut out the bolsters and back spacers and surface grind them when I get close to the measurement I need. But I'm going to be doing those 2 folders a little later. Right now I have 3 mono steel liner locks to finish, and I wanted to bring you along to show you a little more detail on how I lay out the handles, drill them, and all that. So let's go down here. So right now I'm laying out my handle holes, and I've already drilled the bolsters. Now these liners were drilled at the same time, so these holes match. What I like to do is put the handles on one of the liners, clamp them on, they're random lengths, a little longer, a little wider, and drill them through at the same time. And then I'll do the same with the other pieces. Now, you can do these, segmented, where you glue them down to some G10 or something, whatever you want, and you don't have to deal with having separate pieces. I'm not doing that on this build, but either or is fine. But what I like to do is make them long. This is where they're actually going to be. And I'm going to go over to the grinder and cut these to length, grind them to length, and then I will set up these and drill them and do the same thing. So I've already got a couple marks there. That's where my grind marks are going to be. I'm going to take this off and I'll go over and cut them on the grinder. Now I'm going to leave these old broke drill bits in here. They're the same size. They're 5/64 bit. That's the tap size for the liner. I'm not going to do the pass-through hole yet, but I do that so that I can go grind them and they don't move. I can grind them both at the same time. That way I know they'll be even on the liner. So I'm going to just mark this line and we're going to go grind them. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is drill the holes in the other pieces of handle. You want to make sure that your end that you're button up to is straight, of course, and it's ground to the same angle, where if there is any angle. I make sure I get my platen square, but I don't move it, and I grind everything while it's in that position. That way I know I've got a good tight fit up there. What I'll do is come here, butt it up, and then I'm going to clamp it and make sure it's tight up against there and clamp it. I'll put another clamp here, and then we'll go drill the holes for this side. Before we go drill it, I went ahead and put the other clamp on there, but it's something I want to tell you. The reason I don't tap these holes up to this point is for this purpose. I don't want to booger up the threads by drilling through in the handle material. So I get all the holes drilled in the handle material, then I'll come back and thread the holes. But let's get them drilled. So now that I got the holes drilled exactly where they need to be, I'm going to drill the pass-through hole so that a 256 screw can pass through, and then I will screw it into the liner. Now I can tap the liners, but I need to drill these and then counterbore. Before I take them off of the templates, I mark inside and out and which side they are, and I know which is which. That really matters when you start counterboring. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and tap the liners. I'm using what's called a thread forming tap. This is a 256 tap. Basically what it does, instead of cutting, it pushes the threads in. So I'll get these done and we'll move on to the next step. All right, now we can counterbore for our 256 screw. If you notice, it's a 256 screw there. It's passed through. I can pull it out, but we want to sink the head down in there. Now, of course, you have to do some math, figure out the thickness, your final thickness you're going to have of your handles to know how deep to counterbore. These are around close to 50 thousandths. The head is thick, but I'm going to have to go down around 70 to get to where I need to be for my final thickness. Now I'm using a counterbore. It's a 256 button head counterbore. It goes in here into the hole and it'll cut that head circumference. And you just go down the depth you want and come out. Now you can do this on a drill press, and I've shown a tool I've used rigged up on a drill press. I use a cheap set of calipers that I rigged up as a DRO to know how far to go down. But I'm gonna be using my mill because I got one and it's more efficient, a little more accurate for me. So I went ahead and rough cut the scales and put them on there so I can now grind them down to the profile of the frame. Now what I like to do is go ahead and put the stop pin in. I cut it to length and put it in there, and I'll show you how I measure and cut that. Of course, the stop pin is the width from the outside of the frame to the other side, and I still have to cut the barrel pivot. It's going to be cut the same way. It's the width of the frame from outside to outside. So I'll show you that, how I cut it. It's pretty simple using a hand drill and belt grinder. So right now I'm going to go profile it and get ready for the next step, which is to cut the lock bar and mark the scales to relieve them on the lock side. Now we're going to go ahead and cut this pivot pin to length. I've already cut the stop pin to length, but I wanted to show you how I cut the pivot. So what I do is I stick it in there, and I know that my distance here is the same as it is here. And because this is a barrel pivot, I'll be able to take this head off, but I'm going to mark it all the way around. And when I cut this pivot, it's going to be down below the scale or the frame just slightly, like 2 to 3 thousandths. So I'll take it up to that line, I'll stick it in there, test it, and cut it some more if I need to. And now I'm going to chuck this up in my drill, take it over to a grinder and cut it. Now I could put this in my mill and cut it with a collet block or my lathe, but this is real fast. I don't have to do all that setup, and it's a way that you can do it as well if you don't have a mill or a lathe. All right, I've got the pivot in here. I'm going to go ahead and cut it, and I'm going to show you how I cut it and the stop pin. I've got a mark around it where I need to cut it, and it'll be, when I cut that, it'll be about 2 thousandths under the liner. You don't want it flush because your pivot head will spin. You want to be able to tighten it. If you don't have a lathe or a mill, this is a way to do it. Now you probably won't hear this too well because I'm wearing a mic, but here we go. All right, there's our pivot. It's around 1/4 inch, very small. That's one of the problems with making these is you're dealing with small parts, especially when you're hiding the pivot head. Things you have to consider, you have to cut a pocket to hide your pivot head. Cut your pocket in here. You can't cut it too deep or you'll run into issues here when you're contouring. You also have to, when you're considering that, is trim your pivot heads down, but leave enough room to where your wrench will work. These are around 45 thousandths. I'm putting a washer on these because I want as much thread length as I can because I have to handle it in a drill to trim the length of the pivot head. So these threads are cut down. I do all of that in the drill, just like I showed you on cutting the length. You also have to taper this thread so it'll start in your pivot because it's going to have a burr on it when you trim it. All kind of things there to deal with. Same when you trim your pivot, you've got an inside burr. So now what I'm going to do is put bolster on one side, put the pin in, and then we're going to put it together and see how it looks, feels, measurements okay. All right, I went ahead and put the blade in there just so I can make sure everything's working right. I can adjust the tension, and that's about where I want it for now. Working very smooth. So the next thing I want to do is cut the lock bar so I can come in here and mark these scales where I need to make the relief cuts to allow the lock bar to move over to make room for the detent ball. And I need to do all of that before I contour these scales. So I'll get this bolster off of here and we will cut the lock bar. So what I'm going to be using is an abrasive disc in my mill. Now, I've shown in my previous videos on my frame lock series, I highly suggest to go back and watch that whole series because a lot of the stuff you're seeing right here, I cover in that series in very detail. And I showed a couple of methods on how to do this without a mill on a little jig I made with using a trim router or a rotozip rather. But I'm going to chuck this up in the mill and make this cut. All right, with the liner cut, I got my handles mounted on there, and now I can mark the handles to see where I need to cut the relief at. So I'm going to take something real sharp and just run down through there and scribe it. Then I'll take them off, we'll set them up in the mill, and we'll get these cut. There's my scribe lines. So what I want to do is taper this handle material all the way up to where the lock face is. This is where the lock bar will move over, and I'm going to make some room there, around 17 thousandths. So what I have is a shim under here that's tapered. It's thicker here than it is down here. So by the time this bit, I'm going to touch off here with the mill, should be around 17 thousandths here. If not, I'll take another thousandth or two. But now this setup is pretty shady. I'm sure they're going to write a new machinist handbook when they see this. Several people have jigs to do this. There's even some drill jigs that would probably work for this. I think Pop sells them. You could tilt them in there. I'm going to make a jig. I just never have got around to doing it. But this is what I do for now. It takes about 5 minutes to set this up. And once you get it, it's there. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to just barely touch here on the end and come down here. And I'm going to, when I get down here at the end, I'm going to move up some because the lock bar has a sharp 90-degree corner. And this, of course, has a radius. So I've got to cut in a little bit to make room for that corner, top corner of that lock bar. So we're right at about 18 thousandths. That's close enough in my opinion. All right, let's see what we got here. I don't know if you can see that little bit of movement. It's about 18 thousandths. That should give us some freedom for our detent, not to be bound up against the blade. And it's tapered from here to there. All right, now we got to move on to the next step. Of course, I'm not doing a detailed build here. I've got to drill the detent and bend the lock bars and grind the lock faces on the blades and grind the blades. So not a whole lot of other detail than what I've already covered in my frame lock build. You can go back and watch that series. But on the detent ball, I'm just going to come in 50 thousandths from each edge of the lock, and it's up here in the top corner. Now, depending on your design, how you're going to do yours, but that's where mine's going to be. And I'll drill my hole, and we'll set the detent. But I will harden the lock face first before I set the detent. I don't like to heat it up with the detent ball in there. It's a hardened ball. I use flame hardening to do the lock face. I don't carbidize them. So we'll get on to those steps. Follow along. I've got the hole for the detent drilled, but now I need to drill through with a bigger bit. This is a number 44. That'll hold the detent when we stick it in there. The first bit was to put the dimple in the blade here. Now I am going to come down here and touch this hole with this 44 to kind of chamfer it, and that'll help this blade perform better. Like I said, I'm not going to go through a whole detailed build on these liner locks. You can go back and watch my frame lock series. There'll be a link in the description, and you can see me do this in detail. But I figured I'd cover a few things that I may not have covered on the frame lock series. And like I said before, I'm going to be cutting this lock face on 7.5 degrees. I've got my rest set up, and I'm going to be cutting this with a 120 grit belt. Now what you want to do is sneak up on this line. You'll make a bunch of trips back and forth. I usually make at least 3, sometimes 2, and I have got it right off the bat, but you don't want to grind up until that line disappears on the first try. Grind it up close, go put it together, try it out, and then make your adjustments from there. But as you're grinding this is a straight scribed line. I don't know if you can see that. But your final lock face is not going to be straight like that. It's going to have a slight angle to it. In other words, you only want lock up at the very top, and you don't want full face lock up. It won't work properly, and that's how you get a lot of problems like lock rock and stuff like that, sticking. And I find it works a lot more smoother with a liner lock because you're using a thinner liner. So let's get it cut and try it out. All right, that took me about 4 trips, and I take my time, and I like to have early lockup. So once I get close, I just take my time, I put it together, test it out until I like what I have. Because if you overgrind it, you're done. You have to make another blade, and that can be fun since you already have your detent in. I've done it before, but it's not easy. But what I want to show you, okay, you can see what I mean, I hope you can, by early lockup. It's not going anywhere. But what I wanted to show you, if you can see it, is the angle in there of the lock face. Just the top side is catching. In other words, right up here. And then the angle comes back, and there's a little gap in there. Like I said, if you get full lockup, full face lockup, you'll have other issues like lock rock and sticking and all that. So you just want it at the top. It's centering good. And I got to put the scales on here so that I don't over extend the lock bar like that, and do a little tuning. But for the most part, it's done. Okay, I got the lock faces ground on all 3 of them, and they're working pretty good. Just check them out here. And the last one here, looking pretty good. So they're all centering very well. I've got to do some finish work. I got to color the liners and the screws. I'm going to do a little artistic stuff there, try to match up some of the colors with these handles. Now I'm also going to start on those Damascus folders, and I'll be doing that and finishing these on the next video. So if you got any questions, just leave them down below. I thought I'd try to cover a few in-depth details, but this process is pretty much just like the frame lock build, except putting scales on them. And the liners are much thinner. No bearings in these. You just have to cut them into the blades, but they work just great on the washers. They're phosphorus bronze, and they work pretty good. So if you like this kind of content, please comment, like, subscribe. I want to thank my patrons, and I want to thank you for watching.